Sci-fi, horror, fantasy, absurdism in the extreme. It's all available here in the Tales from the Omni Vault book series. Check the description for Amazon links so you can get your copies and start reading today. Thank you all, and now, on to the video. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni Viewer, and I think it's high time we look back at the Heisei Godzilla era in its entirety. For a long time, the Heisei Era set the standard for Godzilla. The kaiju designs that came from this period were ubiquitous, with many of them still prominently featured to this day. Moreover, many fans considered it much better than the Showa era, what with its improved special effects and stronger continuity between entries. As time has marched on, though, debate has risen about if the Heisei Era is really all it's cracked up to be. That's the question we'll be answering today. How well have these movies aged? We've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's start at the beginning. It's been 30 years since Japan was ravaged by Godzilla. In 1984, the discovery of a ship adrift at sea with all but one crewman dead and a huge creepy crawly lurking about signals the worst possible news. Godzilla has returned. As he swims to Japan, a lone scientist tries to figure out some method of luring him away as the government finds itself pressured by America and Russia to let them drop nukes on the beast. Cold War tensions run high as the King of the Monsters makes landfall once again. A few years ago, The Return of Godzilla made my list as one of the best kaiju movies ever made, and I even recently said that it's a better movie than Shin Godzilla. That last one is a very low bar. True, but even putting that aside, I still think it stands out as a classic. There was certainly a risk that the movie could have aged poorly, given how topical it was upon release. Cold War politics are vital to the plot, specifically in how it depicts Japan's position in the conflict. Indeed, this was but one of many movies produced in Japan at the time that expressed fear of the Cold War heating up, and that makes it a tale that really can't be told in any other era. As time passed, it was possible the movie would end up aging poorly and becoming a cultural artifact. Fortunately, the team behind Return knew how to balance the timely with the timeless. The political aspect of the story dominates a good chunk of the middle portion, of that there's no doubt. However, in that space of time, it says everything it has to say on the subject, presenting the conflict and the solution in a satisfying manner. Yes, there is a bit of soapboxing involved here, but it only lasts briefly. Once that part of the movie is done, though, the rest of it is focused on the human aspect. Return doesn't really have a single human star, but instead features an ensemble, the primaries of which exist apart from the political drama. We have a reporter named Goro Maki, the shipwreck survivor Hiroshi Okamura, his sister Naoko, and Professor Minami. None of these characters are especially complex, but they still give the story an everyday perspective. The most interesting one to me is Professor Minami. He seems like a wizened old prophet who sees Godzilla as both a scientific phenomenon and a supernatural threat unlike any other. Hiroshi Koizumi's understated performance brings gravitas to a role that could have otherwise just been a mouthpiece for exposition. He's not quite on the same level as Dr. Serizawa, but he is still memorable. And by having those human elements at the forefront, the movie manages to pass the bar for timelessness. That helps frame the timely political aspect in a historical context, making it comfortably feel like a period piece as opposed to a diatribe that ages out of relevance. Exactly. Now granted, the human characters aren't necessarily the most complex, and they could have been fleshed out a little bit more, but they still work fine in their own way. As for Godzilla himself, this was his return to a villainous role after years of being a hero, and he slips back into it comfortably. Thanks to better facial animatronics and the performance by Ken Satsuma, he shows a good array of expressions, particularly during the battle with the Super X. Actually, quick aside, the Super X is a cool addition to the overall series, but given that this movie's supposed to be a reboot, I do think it's a bit too advanced for a nation with no active military. Anyway, getting back to Godzilla, his role here plays into the apocalyptic themes of the movie by having him be the literal beast thereof. The fact that he rises from a volcano at the beginning and plunges into one at the end is not a coincidence. We are absolutely meant to see him as a living devil rising from and being cast back into hell.
I should also mention that this is one of the few kaiju movies that actually freaked me out as a kid, thanks entirely to the Ahatamaru scene.
Goro finding a bunch of desiccated corpses is freaky enough, but then Shokilas turns up, and it just made my skin crawl. These days I view it with the eyes of an adult and I'm not nearly as bothered, but that initial reaction never left my mind. To this day, I still remember how creepy it initially looked.
Overall, the Return of Godzilla managed to defy the odds and age quite gracefully, and I think it still stands up as a worthy successor to the original film. So, having planted the seeds for a new era, let's see what they grew into.
It's been 5 years since Godzilla plunged into the crater of Mount Mihara, but the people of Japan remain wary that he might emerge again. In hopes of making the ultimate weapon to oppose him in that event, a team of scientists is assembled to develop anti-nuclear energy bacteria made from Godzilla's own cells recovered in the last attack. One of those scientists, Dr. Shiragami, takes a few of those cells back to his home for reasons known only to him. Unfortunately, foreign powers from both America and the Middle Eastern nation of Saradia want the new bacteria for themselves, and they're willing to kill for it. The Americans are even threatening to release Godzilla unless they get what they want. At the same time, a colossal rose has suddenly emerged from a lake near Shiragami's home, and he's responsible for growing it.
I once described Godzilla vs. Biollante as an ambitious movie, and that statement remains true today.
For starters, the human side of the plot is far more involved than usual. There's a complicated espionage plot that has layers upon layers. You have the Japanese characters taking preemptive measures in case Godzilla comes back, even though some dissent exists on the Frankensteinian lengths being taken. You have foreign agents trying to steal the work for themselves, each going to horrific lengths to achieve their goals. Then you have Dr. Shiragami, who has his own agenda that simply involves keeping his deceased daughter Erika alive with biological experiments that result in the birth of a monster. The human side of this movie is anything but boring. So much is going on that you're pretty much guaranteed to be glued to the screen.
The monster side of the story also delivers in a satisfying way.
Although Godzilla isn't present for roughly the first half of the movie, his presence is felt throughout as people brace themselves for his return. It's implied that even without the Americans interfering, he's going to return anyway, and the build-up really drives home the dread everyone is feeling. Once he is back, though, he delivers a memorable rampage. His encounters with Biollante also allow him to be more expressive than in Return, including one of the few moments where he actually seems to be disturbed by his foe. As for Biollante, her rose form conveys a sense of mystery at the beginning, since we're not meant to be sure what her true nature is. In her second form, she manages her own level of expressiveness despite being so huge and lacking a traditional humanoid form.
Seriously, Biollante is one of the most amazing examples of practical effects in the whole series. If you ever hear anybody say the effects in a Godzilla movie are bad, show them the behind the scenes of this movie, and then accept their apologies.
All of this stuff is woven together to near perfection with the themes. First and foremost, the apocalyptic tone from the last film is carried over, but the source has changed. Now it's genetic science that has the world on edge, and a general critique of where modern science finds itself vis-a-vis the political climate. Shiragami, much like Frankenstein before him, has ambitions of conquering death that results in the birth of Biollante, and there's a lot of ambiguity as to whether Biollante is a miracle or an abomination. Anti-nuclear energy bacteria is something that could not only end the threat of Godzilla, but could also render nuclear weapons obsolete, and just the possibility that it might work causes an international incident. The issue is not simply explored as a matter of good guys against bad guys. There's a great deal of nuance that makes the story more intriguing.
Also, did I mention how gross it is?
Godzilla vs. Biollante might be the nastiest entry in the whole Godzilla series, bar none. Strange fluids flow freely, slimy vines writhe around, acidic sap gets sprayed everywhere. This is definitely not a movie you should watch after eating.
Is there anything that could have been done better? Well, I suppose there are a couple of things.
For example, this is the movie where Miki Sakusa is introduced, and although she'll stick around for the rest of the series, she isn't given much to do here. She spends most of her screen time staring off into space, and unfortunately will do so for the next few movies. Also, the final fight doesn't really have an ending. It seems like Godzilla and Biollante just mutually decide to give up at a certain point.
This is probably because the original ending they planned didn't leave much room for a sequel, and they probably couldn't figure out how else to end it, so it was just called a draw.
It's not the most satisfying finale, but that doesn't detract from the overall experience. On the whole, this is still a great movie in my book.
Now we come to the part that I've been dreading, but I said I'd do the whole series, so let's do the time warp again.
A UFO sighted across Japan turns out to be a time machine, the human occupants of which wish to speak with the Prime Minister. They warn that Godzilla will soon return again, and this time he will completely destroy Japan. But they have a plan in place to prevent it. A story is beginning to circulate that a living dinosaur saved a Japanese garrison from the American Navy during World War II, and it's now theorized that this dinosaur was later mutated into Godzilla. If they can go back to the 40s and confirm that the dinosaur is not only real but also the once and future king, they can move it before the bomb is dropped, thereby erasing Godzilla from history. The plan seems to work, but upon returning to the present, a new monster named King Ghidorah has appeared, and more seems to be going on than meets the eye.
I recently released a video about how, while it's still not my favorite movie, I have softened a bit towards Godzilla Final Wars since the first video I did on it. The same cannot be said for Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah.
I don't want to spend too much time on this one because I already did a 3-part deconstruction of it long ago. Suffice it to say that I still see no way to salvage it.
It all begins with that time travel plot, which is the very definition of nonsensical.
People have been trying to make sense of it for years, and every time somebody thinks they've got it figured out, they remember a detail that sets the whole thing back to square one. Whether you apply the grandfather paradox, closed time loop theory, divergent timelines, or wibbly-wobbly timey-wimey stuff, the plot refuses to add up.
Had that been the only issue, the movie might still have been enjoyable in a so-bad-it's-good kind of way, but unfortunately it had to get political.
The underlying agenda of this movie is deeply disturbing, and it requires knowledge of historical context to fully understand why. The short version is that at the time it became known internationally that Japanese schools taught sanitized lessons about the country's actions during the war. The movie not only plays into that during the Lagos Island scene where the dinosaur sides with Japan against the Americans, but also seems to be in favor of bringing back Japanese imperialism.
Writer-director Kazuki Amori would spend the rest of his life denying that this was the intention, even going so far as to say that he's anti-imperialism and has no particular hatred for America.
And do you believe it?
Well, he was as much a product of his culture as any of us would be, and I suppose it's possible that the script just got away from him and it really wasn't meant to turn out the way it did. However,
even if I can convince myself that the Lagos sequence is not specifically anti-American, I just can't believe that the rest of the movie is anti-imperialism. That's not how the puzzle pieces fit together. The villains of any story are supposed to stand for something wrong, something that opposes what the heroes stand for, which is right, and the audience is not supposed to side with the villains.
Ergo, if the villains are anti-imperialism, what does that make the heroes? You tell me.
Pile onto that how Emmy is still the worst written character in the whole Godzilla franchise without exception, and you're left with me baffled by how people once called this the best entry of them all.
Well, you have to admit King Ghidorah looks cool at least.
Well, sure, he's got a good design, but that's not much of a consolation. This was a low point of the series, and it just gets worse every time I watch it. You would think it would be the worst actual movie of the series, but
A meteor strikes the Earth, causing a chain reaction of environmental catastrophes. As if the typhoons and seismic activity weren't enough, Godzilla stirs once more, as does a huge insectoid beast called Battra. It seems that the Earth itself is lashing out against humanity, but there is a glimmer of hope. The disasters have also uncovered the egg of Mothra, who is destined to save the world as she once did in the forgotten past. Mankind waits with bated breath to see if things can be set right.
I once did a video about how Godzilla vs. Mothra's human cast is completely useless. The human characters are just spectators as the kaiju move everything forward. However, I didn't really say much about if I thought the movie was good or not.
Judging from your tone, I'm guessing the answer is not.
You would be guessing correctly, Snazzy.
The issue isn't that the human characters are useless. They definitely are, but the problems run far deeper than that.
You see, Godzilla vs. Mothra was just one of many environmentalist fables to be made in the late 80s and 90s, and it commits every single sin you would expect from the genre.
To begin with, the writing here makes just about as much sense as the last movie does. Things simply don't add up. For starters, we're meant to view the meteor strike at the beginning as the trigger that sets off environmental disaster, but it was the human race who set the charges. The Maritoma Company is specifically singled out as being guilty of deforestation. The problem is that the disasters we see are tropical storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and kaiju attacks, none of which have much of a connection to cutting down trees.
In fact, the kaiju are a completely fanciful consequence. And if it took a meteor to set everything off, does that mean we would have been just fine if it hadn't struck?
Come to think of it, the Maritoma Company was deforesting Infant Island, and that's specified as what uncovered Mothra's egg. Since Mothra is the hero who might have remained buried otherwise, doesn't that mean that cutting down all those trees was actually a good thing?
Oh, but it gets worse.
Battra is said to be the embodiment of Earth's wrath against mankind for environmental exploitation. Yet Battra needs to be stopped because it's suggested that he would eventually destroy the entire Earth as well because he destroys indiscriminately. Mothra therefore needs to stop him on behalf of mankind? Earth? The gods? But aren't they both divine agents? And wait, if Battra is the evil version of Mothra and he also embodies the Earth's fury, does that mean the Earth is evil? But Battra is also supposed to stop another meteor in the future, so does that mean he's actually good? And how the heck does Godzilla factor into this? Why is he ultimately determined to be worse than Battra? Do you see what I mean? This movie raises a whole bunch of questions, but the answers are either vague or contradictory, which is not what you want when you're trying to convey a message.
Speaking of sending a message, what knocks this movie down from bad to insufferable is that it's just so self-righteous and preachy.
Again, this isn't unique to it, but among preachy environmentalist movies, it ranks as one of the preachiest. The issue isn't the message itself. I'm all for people being good stewards of the earth and all that. The issue is that it's only concerned with guilt-tripping the human race and prophesying disaster without offering any solutions.
As far as this movie is concerned, Mother Gaia is angry with mankind and we deserve the dire fate it predicts for us.
Godzilla vs. Ghidorah at least provided some hope that humanity could be part of the solution, but this movie only sees us as the problem. The best it does is tell the audience to do better without elaborating on how. It's like a pastor who only speaks of hellfire and brimstone from the pulpit without ever bringing up the subject of redemption.
I also think it's ironic that this movie is telling the audience to reduce its carbon footprint when you look at how much black smoke is coming out of those explosions. Sure, they're allowed to use gallons of petrol and non-biodegradable material to spread the message of how I should stop driving my car 15 minutes to the grocery store. No double standard there.
Even putting that aside, there's something else that always struck me as weird about this movie. It doesn't feel like it actually belongs in the Heisei continuity.
Sure, we have the returning characters, but certain script elements feel out of step with the series. For example, people are shocked that Godzilla swam through lava and emerged from a volcano alive like they forgot he spent 5 years sleeping comfortably in one. The Cosmos also warned that another meteor will strike Earth in 1999 and obliterate everything unless Mothra stops it, and everyone is really concerned about it. Just last year, though, they were visited by time travelers from the 23rd century, so clearly things work out okay, but I guess we don't remember them either. Heck, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II picks up immediately from the end of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and completely ignores this one. If it weren't for the references made in Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, I might be inclined to think the movie was retconned.
I'm sure a lot of these problems can be chalked up to how the script went through multiple iterations, starting off as a Mothra solo movie and eventually getting recycled to the point where Godzilla was thrown in and it became part of the Heisei Era. But that's not an excuse.
As far as I'm concerned, the only place this sanctimonious, misanthropic, self-contradicting, tree-hugging mess belongs is, in fact, the dumpster. That means that despite a strong beginning, the Heisei series took a sharp downturn very quickly.
Well, let's see if the next movie has the technology to revive it.
A massive egg has been discovered on an isolated island, and it seems likely to hatch. Despite having to dodge a battle between Godzilla and Rodan, the egg is transported back to Japan, where it hatches into a baby Godzilla. Unfortunately, this hatchling draws Godzilla back to the mainland, but this time the land of the rising sun is ready for him. By reverse engineering the recovered future tech of Mecha King Ghidorah, the JSDF has taken a huge technological leap forward with the construction of Mechagodzilla, piloted by the elite members of G-Force. At long last, the Japanese military might finally be able to kill Godzilla, which means Miki Sagusa picked a heck of a time to have a change of heart.
Let me tell you, after the last two movies, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II is a breath of fresh air. For starters, the heavy-handed messaging is gone.
Wait, isn't there a moral at the end?
Technically, yes, but that's hardly the point of the movie.
That bit at the end about how life always conquers artificial life is often said to be tacked on, and for good reason. While there is an underlying theme of valuing life and the dangers of technology, the movie doesn't really draw attention to them until the conclusion, where the characters are all lined up and looking right into the camera as they tell the audience what it was all about.
It's cheesy and unnecessary, because it is, but it also feels self-aware, like the message is being delivered with a wink and a nudge.
Now, that doesn't mean it comes out of nowhere. After all, this is the turning point of the Heisei series where Godzilla becomes sympathetic. This is achieved by having him up against Mechagodzilla, a machine designed for the sole purpose of killing. Furthermore, all Godzilla, and Rodan for that matter, are trying to do is protect Baby, an innocent newborn being held captive by people who only see him as a means to an end, that end being Godzilla's death. The idea of nature versus technology is certainly there, but unlike the previous two movies, it's presented with a bit more subtlety and doesn't need to be spelled out for us the way it is.
When you factor that stuff out, what you have left is a movie that's a bit more escapist than those which preceded it.
The story this time around isn't overly concerned with conveying the message, so it instead prioritizes just letting things play out. There's a greater sense of fun and whimsy, but not to the point where things tilt into cartoon territory. The movie isn't guilt-tripping the audience or putting forward a political philosophy that ages like yogurt. It just invites you to kick back and enjoy it we do.
I mentioned that this is where Godzilla's status in the Heisei Era changes, and that change is handled quite well.
First of all, he doesn't suddenly become a hero after being a villain for so long. He's still incredibly destructive and dangerous to people.
The difference is that the destruction now has a very clear and understandable purpose.
His paternal instincts have kicked in, and he is motivated entirely by finding Baby to raise as his own. Godzilla can't help it if the humans brought the kid to a populated urban area, but if that's where he is, then that's where Godzilla must go. All he wants is a family, and people are using that to bait him into a trap. Ergo, we naturally find ourselves rooting for him against Mechagodzilla even after everything that's been established.
There's also a very small but very significant design change that helps make him more sympathetic, and it's all in the eyes.
For all intents and purposes, it's the same design introduced in '89, but in the previous movies, Godzilla's eyes were very deep set in his head. This is generally considered a creepy facial feature to have, as it makes the face look more skull-like, so in visual media it's usually reserved for villains. With Godzilla there was an added bonus where when the light is just right, the shadows obscure Godzilla's eyes completely, making it look like he has no eyes at all, just empty sockets.
Those deep-set eyes make him look creepy in those other movies, but here his eyes are more pronounced.
They're not bulging out of his head like a horny wolf in a Tex Avery cartoon, but they're not deep-set anymore. You can always see them, and just that makes him look less menacing.
He really has amazing range here.
And he's not the only one. Rodan is also quite expressive.
Boy, does he ever.
You might think Rodan, or Fire Rodan if you want to get technical, wouldn't be all that expressive since he's depicted through puppetry, a necessity born from the choice to make him so much smaller than the other kaiju. After all, the Mothra and Battra puppets from the previous movies, though well made, weren't particularly expressive most of the time. Fortunately, Rodan has expression and emotion for days, and even winds up being the emotional heart of the movie. Like Godzilla, his every motivation is about Baby. Despite being different species, their eggs are in the same nest, so Rodan considers Baby his family. That fraternal love is enough to bring him back from the dead, not to mention it leads to him making the ultimate sacrifice for the kid's protection.
Seriously, not since 1956 has Rodan been this driven by love.
Of course, with everything revolving around Baby, he gets featured a lot. Fortunately, he's very well portrayed, managing to be cute without being saccharine. Maybe it's the dog lover in me, but I see him as akin to a giant puppy who just wants to be loved, and I have a soft spot for him as a result.
He also serves as the very thing that makes Godzilla sympathetic to both the characters and the audience.
For the first time in this continuity, we see an infant of Godzilla's species, and we know that Godzilla was once such an infant as well. It's only natural to care for him, and then to feel that it's wrong to exploit him as a tool for killing his family members. Even Miki, who has been face-to-face with Godzilla several times and is finally able to take an active role against him, starts to feel that killing the king is wrong when faced with Baby's existence. It feels natural, and it will affect things going forward.
Meanwhile, I've got mixed feelings about Mechagodzilla.
For a long time, I wasn't a big fan of this version, since he's better described as a vehicle than a robot, and his design feels wildly impractical. Every aspect of the original Mechagodzilla serves a purpose. Even the tail has a third rocket and an airfoil for flight. This design is much slicker, sure, but why does he have hands if he's not going to do any physical combat? What purpose does the tail serve beyond decoration?
Upon my most recent viewing, though, I realized that the cinematography does wonders for him.
While his vehicle status does prevent him from having a true personality, he's framed in ways that make you wonder if he might after all. At the right angle, he looks downright wicked at times, and that makes up for a lot with him.
As for the humans, they're a mixed bag.
Miki finally takes an active role, as mentioned, which comes with some long overdue character development, so that's a good thing. Azusa also gets a lot to do as Baby's adoptive mother, and she has just as much sass as she does maternal love. Aoki is our leading man, but I'm not sure they tapped into his full potential. I get the arc he has, one that's paralleled by the machine he's so invested in, Garuda. He's a guy with loads of potential who gets written off as a failure, but once he demonstrates his usefulness in the right context, he reaches his full potential. It's a good enough arc for the guy. At the same time, though, it's weird that his hobby is specified as pteranodons, yet he has no reaction whatsoever to seeing Rodan, and no hesitation when ordered to kill him.
You would think, especially given his hobby and the nature versus technology angle, that Aoki would feel at least a bit conflicted about attacking Rodan, but ultimately does so because Azusa's in danger. But no, it doesn't matter.
And the rest of the human cast is definitely there to keep the plot moving. They don't stand out that much, but they don't drag things down either.
Actually, I'd argue the humans are idiots because they make the dumbest decision in the whole series.
Think about it. Godzilla is in Japan, and they figure out that he's looking for Baby, right? So what do? Do they let Baby go so Godzilla can take him? Nope. They move Baby to the basement so Godzilla loses track and leaves, thereby assuring he'll come back and cause even more death and destruction.
Not the brightest move they could have made. Okay, fair point, but still, it's a minor issue compared to everything else this movie does, right?
Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II is a movie I really enjoy. It's not on the same artistic or thematic level as Return or Biollante, but it's a darn sight better than King Ghidorah and Mothra. This one is escapist, and after two bad political diatribes, I can get behind that.
And it's got plenty of space to do just what it wants. Speaking of space...
Somehow, Godzilla's DNA wound up in space and evolved into a new alien life form named SpaceGodzilla. Miki receives a warning from the cosmos about the alien's approach, and how she must ensure Godzilla's survival so he can protect the planet. That's not going to be so easy, since G-Force has a new mecha ready to launch, the Mobile Operations Godzilla Expert Robot Aerotype, Mogera for short. This mech is being piloted by Yuki, a man determined to avenge his best friend by killing Godzilla, and no space monster is going to get in his way.
Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla has a reputation for being a low point of the Heisei series. And while I agree it's certainly not the best, I don't think it's the worst either. I think what drags it down is the human side of the story. While the characters aren't as useless as the ones in Godzilla vs. Mothra, they're pretty darn close.
Miki, for example, is set up as having an active role to play on two fronts. First, she's somehow supposed to aid Godzilla in the fight against SpaceGodzilla, and second, she's involved in Project T, an attempt to psychically control the G-Man.
You would think these two ideas would somehow tie together, but they don't.
Project T is very quickly shown to be a failure, and it leads to a subplot of Miki getting kidnapped by the Yakuza that gets wrapped up by the halfway point with little fanfare. Miki having a psychic link to Godzilla also doesn't lead into the fight against SpaceGodzilla at all. She doesn't need to control him to save Earth. He's got all the motivation he needs when little Godzilla gets imprisoned in Crystal. She contributes so little to the story that when the Cosmos congratulate her at the end, I'm left asking what she did to deserve it.
I see no evidence that she guided Godzilla or that she intentionally sabotaged Project T, so what's the deal?
Well, she definitely provided moral support, for all that it matters to Godzilla.
Yuki is the only other active member of the plot, and while he does have a character arc, it's not enough to save the movie.
You see, Yuki is supposed to be a tough guy hero out for revenge, who eventually abandons his vendetta when faced with his true enemy. It should be interesting, and it even links back to the events from Godzilla vs. Biollante. Unfortunately, actor Akira Imoto tends to look more bored than stoic for most of the runtime.
We also don't really see why he changes his mind about Godzilla.
You would think that it's got something to do with little Godzilla, since he seems fond of the kid and appears to abandon his grudge after SpaceGodzilla's first attack. Yet once he's in the cockpit of Mogera, he goes rogue and attacks Godzilla without any remorse, only to once again decide that SpaceGodzilla is the real priority because... yes.
I just don't understand his thinking, and I don't think the movie does either.
Other human characters tend to just blend together. The other two Mogera pilots are implied to be underdogs with something to prove, but the only interesting thing about them is that one of them has a crush on Miki that will be forgotten by the next movie. This commander apparently knows Yuki personally as well as professionally, but their dynamic is never elaborated on. One of the Project T guys turns out to be connected to the Yakuza, and his demeanor changes so drastically after this reveal that I briefly thought he was a different character entirely. Then you have the random citizens of Japan whose responses to kaiju attacks are treated as comedic this time around, something that's never happened in any of the Heisei movies before.
It feels so incongruous with the rest of the Heisei films.
And yes, this is different from the hobo in Return of Godzilla. He provides some levity, sure, but he also plays into the apocalyptic tone. His attitude is that if the world is ending, he may as well indulge himself on his way out. This is dark humor fueled by fatalism. Here, though, the reactions exist solely to provide a laugh, which makes them unnatural to the scenes they're in. I'm not opposed to some well-placed humor to alleviate mounting tension, but this movie has no real tension, so these comedic moments are severely out of place.
Then you have the moral, which is the most tacked on of the whole series. In case you don't know, the issue of space pollution actually is real. but it refers more to leaving junk and debris in planetary orbit, where it can be a hazard to astronauts and stations, or if it becomes too dense, make it difficult for ships to leave the planet. I'm sorry, but there is just no way SpaceGodzilla is allegorical of that.
He doesn't even come from Earth's orbit. He comes from deep space, and he's the product of a biological entity that doesn't exist in reality. I genuinely don't understand why they even bothered, since it's such a non sequitur.
The plot also feels a bit directionless, more like it's meandering from scene to scene rather than marching forward with purpose.
As mentioned, Project T is set up as a big deal, but it goes absolutely nowhere. After SpaceGodzilla imprisons Little Godzilla, Miki stays on the island purely so she can get captured by the Yakuza, and then she's rescued very quickly. What the Yakuza plan to do with her is never properly explained. Miki suddenly uses telekinesis for the first and last time, and it doesn't amount to much. By the end, things are more focused, but getting there is a bit boring because so little effort was put into making the story engaging.
I heard that Akira Ifukube refused to score the movie after reading the script. Can't say I blame him.
As for the monsters, they're a bit better, but they're still not perfect.
Godzilla gets some good characterization as a parent to Little Godzilla, but he unfortunately doesn't show up as much as he should have. This is because the suit is in rough shape after being in action so long, which is most noticeable in the tail. In this shot, you can even see a piece fly off it. All things considered, though, they still made sure he got the final shot in the end, so I'll give them that. Little Godzilla is cute and all, but his primary job is to get captured so Godzilla is motivated to fight SpaceGodzilla, so there's not much else to say about him.
SpaceGodzilla, meanwhile, straddles the line between being a good villain and a bad villain.
His design is iconic, make no mistake of that. Inspired by the Super Godzilla video game, he strikes an imposing figure, the crystals blending in nicely with the Godzilla body. Some nice visual storytelling is also done with him. Although the dialogue leaves the question of how Godzilla's cells got into space open-ended, things like the jowl tusks or the way he dissolves into glitter when he dies all point to the likelihood that he is Biollante, or at least a fragment of her twisted into something horrific. That said, his personality does ultimately boil down to generically evil with no clear motivation for wanting to destroy Earth. Granted, it works just fine, and we have no trouble hating him after he attacks a child. If his role is just to be evil for evil's sake, he hits the right notes.
Mogera, on the other hand, is a mech I want to like more than I actually do.
On the plus side, I actually like his design. Unlike Mechagodzilla, Mogera looks practical, like every part of him serves a function rather than just being there for decoration. I also dig that he can split, making him the closest thing the Godzilla franchise has to a combining robot. On the minus side, though, I just can't believe that he's meant to be more advanced than Mechagodzilla when he's clearly shown to be incapable of winning a fight. Plus, do you remember how I said the last movie uses camera tricks to make it look like Mechagodzilla has a personality? No such effort is made here. Mogera really is just a big tank/jet that happens to look like a huge metal penguin. So despite it all, I'm not really sad to see him go at the end.
In the end, Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla is a mixed bag, with the good elements and bad elements mixing together to make something that's just middling. I've seen worse, sure, but I've also seen far better. But now that we've finished that, it means we're at the grand finale, and that's not gonna be an easy watch.
Godzilla appears in Hong Kong, and something is clearly wrong. His body and spines are glowing fiery red, and his behavior is erratic, as if he's in pain. According to a bright young researcher, Godzilla is like a biological nuclear reactor, and after the destruction of Bass Island, his system is overloading to the point where he's either going to explode or melt down. Either way, when he goes, he's taking the whole planet with him. At the same time, creatures revived and mutated by the oxygen destroyer's use 40 years prior have emerged, and they're constantly evolving into horrifying new forms. To top it all off, Little Godzilla has mutated into Godzilla Jr., and as always, he's going to get caught up in G-Force's plans.
Well, here we are at the end, and for a long time Godzilla vs. Destoroyah was considered the end. It's not often that a long-running film series actually gets to have a definitive ending, so there was a lot riding on this movie to get it right, especially after the last movie. So, did the Heisei Era close on a high note?
Well, to start things off, let's say the continuity is strong with this one. I don't think any other movie in the franchise has gone to such great lengths to be a sequel to Gojira as this one did. Background references abound, from a replica of Dr. Yamane's Stegosaurus skeleton to images of the original cast. Two of the primary characters are specified as descendants of Dr. Yamane by way of adoption, and of course Destoroyah is a direct consequence of the Oxygen Destroyer, though we'll discuss that more later. They even managed to get Momoko Kochi to reprise her role as Emiko.
This isn't just fan service like some latter-day Marvel movie. These elements are vital to the story and help bring the series full circle.
Remember, this was supposed to be the last Godzilla movie, so the act of tying it back to the first holds meaning. Perhaps the most significant connection is how a modern scientist is experimenting with micro-oxygen, which is eerily similar to Serizawa's research that resulted in his accidental invention of a weapon. This adds a sense of pessimism to the story not seen since Biollante, for it suggests that humanity has not learned anything since the 50s, and Serizawa's sacrifice might have been in vain.
Speaking of not learning anything, though, this movie has the same issue that's plagued these movies since 1992. Have you noticed that since the Mothra movie, I haven't been mentioning the humans as much in my plot synopses? That's not an accident.
While there have been characters with arcs and goals and the like, they haven't been the ones moving the plots for a while, and the same applies here.
I only think it's a mistake here because so much effort is put into tying things back to the original Gojira, where the human characters were very important. As such, having them just stand by here feels like a mistake.
I get what it was going for, mind you. Considering the apocalyptic stakes, there is a sense of hopelessness on display as we see that after every other attempt has failed, all the characters can do is just sit there, watch, and pray for a miracle. At the same time, though, having them a bit more involved would have been more in line with what the first movie did.
Since I'm doing the critiques here, I may as well mention an anomaly involving Destoroyah because I don't know where else to put it.
When we first encounter the small aggregate forms in the Alien-style sequence, we clearly see that Destoroyahs can be killed by fire. The next thing we hear, though, the plan is to freeze them because they're suddenly vulnerable to extreme cold, and the switch is never explained.
I mean, sure, you can kill things in real life by either burning them or freezing them, but these are kaiju we're talking about, and there's really no reason given to assume that Destoroyah is vulnerable to freezing at all.
Heck, all freezing did to Godzilla was slow him down a bit, so why assume that it would harm Destoroyah? I don't know, it's just always bugged me.
But still, the monsters do a good job carrying the story overall.
When it comes to Junior, his scenes are difficult to watch. It's a relief when we see him alive after the island's destruction, but he does nothing but suffer from that point onward. Audiences are already braced for Godzilla's death thanks to the posters, but Junior's death hits really hard because we weren't prepared for it. His presence changed Godzilla significantly, and with him gone, the tragedy of Godzilla only increases.
Some of that sounds like he's more of a plot device than a character.
Well, I didn't mean to make it sound that way, though now that you mention it, I suppose that is the case. Still, if Junior is a plot device, he's undeniably a sympathetic one.
Getting around to Destoroyah, he just might be one of the strangest kaiju ever. He often gets compared to Ghidorah, given how he starts as a microbe that gets bigger and stranger as he evolves. He even follows the same pattern, starting in the water, then morphing from a crawling landform to a flying form, and finally an ultimate form. Because of that, and because he's one of the only kaiju ever to succumb purely to military might, he doesn't get the sort of respect that he deserves.
What doesn't get mentioned that often is that Destoroyah is a dark reflection of Godzilla, as exemplified by their similar origins.
Contrary to popular belief, Destoroyah was not made by the Oxygen Destroyer. He was simply mutated by it. The microbes that would become Destoroyah were already there since time immemorial, and exposure to the chemicals in Serizawa's unwanted invention made them into something deadly. This parallels how Godzilla already existed, and the atom bomb made him into a monster.
It all harkens back to a point I made years ago about the original movie.
The message of the first movie is not just that atomic and nuclear weapons are bad. It presents the oxygen destroyer as something just as bad, if not worse than the bomb, and puts a Japanese man who has seen the horrors of war firsthand in the same position as America back in 1945. He has a devastating weapon that could destroy the world, but if he uses it against a foe that refuses to quit, he could end the conflict and save lives.
Even back then, the filmmakers knew how complex the topic actually was. And this movie brings everything full circle by showing that the oxygen destroyer, like the atom bomb, also had long-reaching consequences.
This makes Destoroyah a true foil to Godzilla, a creature of similar origin with a very different personality. Where Godzilla attacks when provoked, Destoroyah attacks because it enjoys killing. Why else would it torture Junior the way it does?
Even the possibility that Destoroyah might help contain Godzilla's meltdown is abandoned when he reveals himself to be just plain evil.
Then there's the matter of how he dies. In the movie, he retreats and is gunned down by the JSDF.
There is an alternate ending that was filmed but not completed, where Godzilla does finish Destoroyah off himself. I know some would have preferred that be the true ending of the movie, but as for me, I think what we got works just fine.
There's no question that Destoroyah is licked. Godzilla constantly tears him down no matter what, and the whole reason Destoroyah flees is because he knows he can't win. The outcome was already determined, really.
Besides, the movie is ultimately about Godzilla anyway, and it really does him justice here.
Obviously, the burning Godzilla design is considered iconic, with the pulsing red glow immediately cueing the audience into how something is wrong. This is further enhanced by Ken Satsuma's performance. Through all those layers comprising the suit, he conveys the agony Godzilla feels, both the physical pain of his overloading reactor and the emotional pain of losing Junior.
Even Akira Ifukube's new theme is deliberately off-putting.
It has a similar sound and structure to the classic theme, but it's not quite right, filled with staccato notes and horns blasting louder than usual. It all comes together in a complete depiction of a creature in pain.
And it all culminates in that ending. Every G-fan knows the experience of watching this movie for the first time and being moved to tears by that final death scene. And even after you know what's gonna happen, it's still really powerful.
Satsuma gives it his all, pushing the suit to its limits as he writhes in agony. The sound cuts almost entirely. All we hear is Ifukube's Requiem piece and a few select roars and lines of dialogue. Multiple techniques are implemented to make the shots look as good as possible, and the end result is one of the greatest death scenes you'll ever see outside of a Shakespeare play. Then, of course, we get that glimpse at the end where Junior has revived and grown up by absorbing his father's energy, saving Tokyo and the world, but also leaving us wondering what he'll do next. There's a strange mixture of emotions that happen. Junior survives, so he can continue the legacy, but after everything he's been through, will he be friendly or hostile? And what will mankind do if he ever undergoes a meltdown?
We feel joy mixed with dread, making for a bittersweet ending that's appropriate for a movie so closely tied to the first film.
It's a great ending, all right. In fact, it's so great you could argue that it makes up for any earlier missteps. Would you call that manipulative?
Well, maybe, but hey, if it works, it works. I started this very long video by asking if the Heisei Godzilla movies aged well. Having recently watched them all again, here's what I've determined.
If I were to plot them on a chart, the Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante would start us off at a high point. Then we would dip very low with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and Godzilla vs. Mothra, rise up a bit with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla II, dip down a bit again with Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, and finally end somewhere in the high middle with Godzilla vs. Destoroyah.
So starting with high peaks, going into low valleys, then ending somewhere in the middle. What does that mean for the series overall?
Well, I guess it means the Heisei Era aged oddly.
Bear in mind that back when they were new, Biollante was a flop while King Ghidorah and Mothra were runaway hits. These days, though, Biollante is now viewed as an artistic masterpiece, while the other two are considered messes, basically the inverse of how they were initially received. As I see it, that makes the Heisei series an interesting case study in how much attitudes can change over time. What once failed is now respected, and what once succeeded is now seen as dated and sloppy.
So I guess in the end, the Heisei Era is average. On an individual level, you'll find high peaks and low valleys, but looking back at the bigger picture, it all evens out. Besides, Gamera did it better in the 90s anyway. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. Well, that took a very long time. Wonder what I'm gonna do next to top it.
How about the Heisei Mothra trilogy?
Oh, I don't know if I have the strength to go through those ones.
Okay, since you brought it up at the end, how about the Heisei Gamera trilogy in its entirety?
Maybe.